Resident Evil 2 was a masterpiece developed in 1998 as a follow-up to the smash hit released 2 years prior. With fond yet traumatic memories, it's a game that still resonates with many of us gamers. It has a simple story with likable characters and, at the time, photorealistic graphics with a direction that pulled you in for ultimate immersion. But to understand the success of Resident Evil 2 is to understand the underlying mechanics that made it the incredible experience that it is. A combination of unique gameplay elements that were put into play by Shinji Mikami, which he dubbed survival horror, a new genre. The purpose was to put you directly into the leading role of a B-horror zombie film, accomplished through cinematic shots and an immersive atmosphere to create some truly authentic, tension-filled moments. And the horror wasn't accomplished without a considerable challenge to players. Remember when you first started up Resident Evil 2? Immediately you're thrown into an intense moment with no grasp of the controls and no ammo, surrounded by zombies and fire. You have no other choice but to run straight into them until you die. All the camera angles are facing you, so you have no idea where you're going or what you're going to run into. It teaches you its gameplay the way I was taught to ride a bike. No brakes, no helmet, and push down a hill, hitting every branch along the way. After all this hardship, getting to the police station was like a breathtaking moment of respite. After multiple close encounters, you barely make it by dragging your bum-ass leg through these pearly gates. Then, once you get through this door loading screen, music never sounded so good. The opening chapter perfectly sets your expectations for the rest of the game. It tells you it's a challenging game that will throw you into intense situations in which you may or may not survive. The game trusts the player to use their brain and to quickly adapt to each encounter. You have to think about things such as inventory space, puzzles, and keep mental notes of memos, your health, and how many bullets you have. The game is incredibly challenging and rewards players through their efforts. The Resident Evil series is no longer developed with that in mind. Most modern developers aim to make games that accommodate all playstyles. They want to make their games accessible to everyone, to ship more copies. But in doing this, with a series like Resident Evil, they isolate players that like the way it was before. You would think that Capcom's own Monster Hunter series is proof enough there's a market for difficult, counterintuitive games. If they want more proof, just look at Dark Souls and what kind of impact it created. But Capcom's not without good reason. There's no telling if Resident Evil would be as successful as it is today if it wasn't for the direction they went with the series. In order to expand their marketability of a game, Capcom is willing to sacrifice and change whatever it takes to sell more copies, even if that means altering the intent and design of an already established series, as in the case with Resident Evil. In recent years, with Resident Evil 7 being an almost complete return to form, it felt Capcom was nearly right back on track after derailing completely and getting lost somewhere in the woods with Billy.
Been fantasizing about me, have you?
To get you better prepared for Resident Evil 2 releasing in just a few short days, it's best to understand what makes survival horror and why it's important to Resident Evil, but also
why it had to die.
But what is survival horror to the Resident Evil series? It's that feeling of isolation. The claustrophobia of cramped hallways and dead ends. The fear of imminent danger and the unpredictability with each new area or encounter. It's the unease you feel from the sickly moaning liquor just out of view. You have limited ammo and health, limited movement, and a limited field of view. You have very few escape routes and limited options for your next inevitable encounter. And when it does happen, will you be prepared? The Resident Evil games were entirely designed to stress your natural fight-or-flight response, encouraging you to calculate your every move and always prepare for the worst. Because of the unique experience survival horror offered, everybody had to swoop in with their own vision and contribution, even Konami. And wouldn't you know it, Silent Hill released this very month 20 years ago. Happy 20th anniversary, Silent Hill! You're still my favorite. The genre is now known as classic survival horror. Over time, survival horror evolved into a shell of its former glory. With less limitations in modern hardware and through the changing, adding, or removing various mechanics in the gameplay, be it the perspective, controls, or overall direction, it lost its spirit and its original intention. As the demand for more action-based multiplayer games began to grow, production of survival horror came to a dead crawl. Despite this, Resident Evil was still doing very well for Capcom, but that wasn't without a considerable effort on their part. The first major deviation from the classic survival horror formula was with Resident Evil 4 in 2005. While it still held many of the series' core values, it traded off atmospheric horror for a tense arcade-like action-filled romp. It felt more like a fun spin-off than a traditional Resident Evil game. While I enjoyed it, it didn't quite scratch that itch, that yearning for an atmospheric horror experience. Nobody imagined a day Capcom would abandon the classic gameplay, but they did. They sure did. Resident Evil 4 succeeded in keeping the series fresh and modern for the quickly evolving gaming market, and sold well to much critical acclaim. With the strong sales and high praise for Resident Evil 4, it only made sense for Capcom to keep on the same path and continue their market expansion with Resident Evil 5. Around the time, multiplayer games were on the up and up, thanks to Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Capcom took elements from already popular games, namely first and third-person shooters, like Gears of War, for its online cooperation. With Resident Evil 5, instead of tacking on something with multiplayer, they completely adapted the gameplay around having a co-op player with you at all times, reducing any feeling of isolation and horror. Seems they wanted to turn Resident Evil into an action-based shooter, with horror themes by this point. With the way the market was headed, Capcom knew and have already resolved they couldn't design their games around atmospheric survival horror if it meant disempowering the player or delaying the action even slightly. If you're aiming to be an action-heavy game, combat can't feel gratifying if it's restrictive in any way. Rather than implementing limitations on the player to induce tension, it became the exact opposite. However, this was a financial explosion of success for the company. No, I mean seriously. Not only is it the highest selling game in the entire series, but according to Capcom, it has sold 10.9 million copies. That would put it right above Monster Hunter World as the #1 best-selling Capcom game. I know I might be jumping ahead a little, but even with Resident Evil 6, the game we all thought bombed, shipped 8.7 million units. Well, I guess it's easy to understand why these games mark the turning point of the series, and why you really can't blame Capcom for the direction they took. Capcom was reeling the mainstream for the bait they needed to hook the casual gamer. They are a business after all, and a good one. Resident Evil 6 was the cumulative result of all their attempts to reach the widest market possible since Resident Evil 4. They even had a campaign for everybody to make everyone happy. If you want a more action-based game, then play Chris's campaign. If you want survival horror, then play Leon's campaign.
Oh my god.
If you want experimental, then play Jake's. They even have an Ada game for the die-hard fans. As you can see, Resident Evil 6 was geared more towards accessibility to appease everyone, but as a result, it appeased no one, except Genry. He really liked it. Resident Evil 6 just did not do survival horror justice. It was so streamlined that not even a single recognizable element from the original classic games remained besides the characters. Utilizing fluid and responsive controls, being able to free cam and aim wherever you want, better express the action. In doing so, they broke survival horror. Now, with the mandatory co-op buddy, you never have to feel isolated or alone again. Therefore, breaking survival horror. That isolated feeling is an element that enhanced atmosphere and immersion. Taking one thing away breaks everything else. The zombies ever getting you down? Don't worry, your co-op buddy will help you up. This eliminates the fear of death, breaking the fight or flight response in survival horror and just leaving the fight option, which the game empowers you to do very well. The open environments break any feeling of claustrophobia, the trapped feeling of survival horror. No longer are you disempowered or limited in any way. The horror just isn't even there. Just this unrealistic, over-the-top action and monsters. While it feels great to activate God mode, the exhausting action wears on you fast, and you get bored. And you crave more thought-provoking games. Like Resident Evil! No, wait, no. Like Resident Evil! No, I don't even want to look at it. I know, like Resident Evil! Ugh! When I saw where the series was headed, I was pretty much done playing anything new due to the direction they took. Even though I played Resident Evil 5 and 6, I just borrowed them from friends and played them with friends. Never would I give Capcom money for such a bastardization of one of my favorite series. Though it is nice they're pulling in new fans, as a result of it, they're neglecting the old. And now they have to accommodate for fans of both playstyles, meeting somewhere in between where it's not quite great. Despite their expectations with Resident Evil 6, Capcom was taken aback by the criticism the game received, and people finally started vocalizing their concerns for the derailed series. It's about time. With that game, Capcom overestimated the mainstream and shot way too high and way too far. What they ended up with was very impressive looking garbage! Then, a miracle happened. Capcom listened to us. They actually listened to us. They promised to seriously rethink the direction of the series and return to their roots. Well, I've heard that before, but with Resident Evil 7, they delivered. Everyone was blown away by its complete return to form. Even with the change in perspective, it was still able to pull off the classic feeling of survival horror. Although a reboot of the series, it felt like a true Resident Evil game. Its atmosphere was terrifying, and it was topped off with an excellent story and relatable characters. It was dreadful and unpredictable for the most part, with many memorable, frightening moments. But some of the post-release DLC was cause for concern, as it had inconsistent storyline changes, dates, plot holes, and especially concerning was the DLC with Mountain Man Joe and his undying redneck dedication to his family, collecting junk and crafting harpoons to throw at the alligators. And he was getting into wrestling matches with his brother while throwing insults.
You never had it in you. You were a wimp, Jack. Never could beat me. Just to go lost now. Told me I can't steal from your ass.
Then this happens. You have to admit, it was hilarious. But Capcom swears it is canonical, so you have to take it seriously. Wait, show me that again? Resident Evil 7 went on to be yet another financial success, selling 5.7 million copies and growing. As you can see, in their misdirection of the Resident Evil series, Capcom prevented it from going under. In pulling in a crowd of action-based shooter fans, they grew their numbers and profits, making the series more successful than ever in a time where survival horror was at an all-time low. Now with the looming release of Resident Evil 2, we've seen plenty of gameplay and even played a 30-minute demo. The developers said their every intention was to recreate the experience of the original game. Will Capcom make a hit or a miss? More importantly, we should all ask ourselves this: will Resident Evil 2 be the remake we asked for? That's it for now. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch. Like, subscribe, and share while you're at it. I have a lot more to say in the next video, as you can imagine, with Resident Evil 2 coming out. This project so far has been a massive effort, requiring many long days of editing and writing and no sleep. It was supposed to be one long video, but I wanted to get at least something out before the release of RE2. I'm exhausted from this, but I'll still be playing the game very soon with everyone else. Big thanks to everyone pledging support to me on Patreon. Keeps me slaving away in front of the computer screen for you. Assuming it's available by the time you watch this, watch part 2 of this series. If not, you can also watch my Resident Evil 7 review, which was also a massive undertaking, and it's almost an hour long, so if you have an hour to spare, go watch that. Please put it towards me.